And welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we are piggybacking off of what number podcast was it?
179.
179. So we were talking about what happens when your body is resisting fat loss. So this is kind of like a part 2 series, but kind of its own episode a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's just kind of like, I feel like when we get on a train of thought, like it lends itself to multiple episodes in a row. It's like, oh, this problem we just solved in this episode, but that leads to this, and that leads to this. And then we just kind of have a string of episodes that we want to do. And I think it's good that it goes in sequence though, because it keeps you guys kind of learning what's next. So last episode, if you didn't listen, and you might have only clicked on this because you have an interest in lab work, but if you have not listened to 179 yet, highly recommend that you do, because it covers all the things that are kind of prerequisites to really being able to turn to labs and say, like, this is the only other thing that could be off. And so a lot of us tend to feel like our hormones, our labs, our internals are just off, when in reality, a lot of that can be self-corrected through the habits, diet, and exercise, but more granular details than just eating healthy and exercising, really taking care of those higher level details. And so that's what that episode goes into. And what I will say with that, because even that I feel like ruffles feathers a little bit, is like, no, like I feel off though. Like I don't feel like myself. And I'm not saying that you can't also get your labs checked in those situations, but it's just that there are low hanging fruit that do make a really big difference. And a lot of times hormonal dysregulations are caused by perpetuating the wrong habits with our nutrition, our training, our stress, our mindset. And so if we're not addressing those simultaneously, then no matter what we do with our lab work, the stuff will come back. Like it's not as easy as just, slap a pill on it and it'll get better. Western medicine will tell us that it will, but it doesn't. So
Yeah, and I think it's really important because like there are a lot of things that we can be doing that support hormonal health and other basic things that will help a lot, but I will say I'm a big fan of lab work because I always tell our clients it's kind of like checking under the hood, right? Just taking
yeah,
a peek, seeing what's going on. But again, it's not a necessity. It's not something. But if you just are curious and you want to, get at least a baseline, I recommend getting labs done because if everything comes back and it's great and you're normal within range within everything, like if something happens, a 6 months or a year or 2, 3 years from now, you at least have something to go back on and be like, okay, well, I was feeling really good, and these are where my levels were at, and so you can kind of compare and contrast. So I'm a big fan of lab work, but yes, it's also kind of like it's not a necessity.
yeah, it's good to have a baseline for sure. And typically you'll get a baseline with like your annual physical, and you'll typically get a complete metabolic panel and typically a complete blood count with differential. That's like pretty standard for your annual physical. Sometimes they'll throw a TSH in there, like a thyroid level, but typically not getting everything that you ideally would want to see in a blood panel when you do go for your annual physical, but that's like a good starting place. And then you can always go deeper from there. So first, like, let's just kind of break down like when, beyond just like your annual physical and your annual checkup, like when should you get your labs drawn? And I will say few scenarios. One of them is that symptomology that we'll talk about a little bit more in detail, but I'll also say like big life change milestones are also good times to get baselines. So if you know that you're kind of on the cusp of entering menopause or perimenopause, you're in your 40s or 50s, like get a baseline, see how things change and pay more attention to it at that point in your life. Or let's say you want to conceive, like labs before beginning to try and labs after you deliver and kind of recover a little bit, like being able to check on stuff like that. I feel like big life milestones if you are somebody who likes to kind of have reference points to dial back to, those could be really good timestamps in your life to kind of have data from. Not necessary by any means, and that's not the main time that I think it's really necessary to look into, but it's good information in different phases of life, I feel like.
Yeah, and then I will do a little asterisk and say after delivery, it's important to notate if you're breastfeeding or not, because if you're still breastfeeding, that can make some things pretty wonky. It's definitely recommended to test hormones after you're done breastfeeding, and I think it's typically recommended 2 to 3 months after weaning.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, kind of after that, it's like if you're still off at that point, okay, like let's dive in a little bit deeper. But the
Yeah.
biggest point that we want to look at more blood work, what's going on under the hood, is when you really do have everything dialed in and you're just not seeing results, or in some circumstances, seeing the opposite of results and literally seeing
Hmm.
things go backwards. And when I say backwards, I mean, you're hitting your macros to a T, you're not estimating, you're getting your training in, you're getting your steps in, sleeping as best you can, and perhaps the weight on the scale is going up instead of down. And we often see this with like you're eating low calories, and this is happening like 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 calories a day, consistently not doing the like binge on the weekends thing, like actually sticking with it, and weight is climbing. And these are really frustrating situations and circumstances. And it is really disheartening. Like, I hate that these things even happen, because it's like, I want you to put in the effort and see the results. But there are kind of probably 1 to 2% of cases that this does happen when you're all dialed in and things go the wrong direction, or just nothing's moving and you've just been out of plateau forever, that it is very warranted to look under the hood, because sometimes it's as simple as vitamin and mineral deficiencies that you can solve with a little bit of supplementation, a little bit of changing focus in your food, that does change the rate limiting step in certain metabolic processes that allows you to get the ball rolling again. And so
Yeah.
it can be simple. It doesn't have to be complex laundry lists of supplements, but that would be like the big time to look under the hood. What do you think?
I was going to say for most people, it's like a vitamin D deficiency,
Oh,
like
yeah.
for most people. um, so yeah, and I think that a lot of times I'll hear like, it doesn't really, a lot of people will supplement and they won't really feel that much of a difference, but they'll feel it if you take it away. And that's kind of where they notice it. But I think it's hard because there's like general symptoms that we can list off, but then it gets like more specific as far as like, okay, is it a thyroid thing? Is it a hormonal thing? Like, kind of like diving into specific areas. But I will say, like, okay, exactly like you're saying, like I'm plateauing, but it's not just like unexplained weight changes, like I'm going up or down in one direction. But it could be something like fatigue or weakness or chronic pain, or like I think the big one for women is like menstrual like irregularities. So like if you're having like changes, if you're having missed periods or like an inconsistent cycle, very painful periods, those are some like red flags. And then hormonal could be like, okay, well maybe I have hair loss, or I'm having hair grow in other areas, or I'm having a change in libido, or I have some unexplained hormonal acne, or you have some digestive issues. Like there's just a huge array of symptoms. But I would say kind of the big one is like you feel like a change. Like you don't feel like
Like,
something feels off. Yeah, you don't feel like yourself. So I would say that's kind of like, and a lot of things, it could be even mood changes, like changes with your mood. Maybe you feel more depressed, or you have like mood swings, or you feel more stressed, or like you have brain fog, or like trouble concentrating. And then I would say, if we're going into like thyroid, it's like maybe you're having issues with like temperature regulation, like you're feeling cold or you're feeling really hot, or you're having issues with like blood sugar. So there's so many different symptoms that you could experiencing.
Yeah.
But those would be like, I want to say it's not just like, oh, okay, my weight's plateauing, but
Yeah.
these are all kind of symptoms that would be like, okay, yeah, this is a good idea to let's check some things out.
Well, and too, because it's like scenario A is like you're doing all the things and all the weight is going in the opposite direction. That almost never comes independently of all the
Mm-hmm.
other stuff you just listed. There's usually
Exactly.
more going on. And then I would even be, pretty cautious to say that you have everything dialed in perfectly because A, no one's perfect, we're not robots. And B, when you have symptoms like that, mood swings, like cravings, like just drastically ranging symptoms in all these different things that you had just mentioned, it's pretty hard to stick like 100% with a protocol when you feel like shit. And so that's pretty much like the caveat is like, okay, maybe these symptoms are so pronounced that is actually preventing you from doing things to the level and the capacity that you know you're capable of. Like a 10 out of 10, I confidently should be able to handle this, and I'm not for whatever reason. And that's where I feel like it comes into where I'm not feeling myself comes in. And that's where it can be a really big signal to you to look under the hood because I don't think that it's all in your head. Like it can be physical and physiological. Are there mindset components to it? Sure, absolutely. There always are. But a lot of times there can be like actual physiological things contributing and you're not crazy and we just need to look a little bit deeper.
Yeah, yeah. And I will also say that from our experience with our clients, that sometimes it can be something that you really have to advocate for yourself. If you
Really.
go into your doctor, yeah, like really, like you got to feel very confident in what you're asking. There are some things that you can throw in there that sometimes providers will be a little bit more apt to like, okay, fine, like we'll test you, which I don't understand. I really don't understand why it's so difficult for them to like order
There's like
labs.
a specific set of criteria that like warrants ordering types of labs. Like if you check the box for weight gain, unexplained weight gain, then you can get thyroid tested. If you check the box for, and so if they don't hit that criteria, like I think I told you this a while back when I was like doing all my self experiments on my hormones, and I went to the doctor and I was like, I want to get all this tested. She was like, why? And I was like, because I'm
Yeah.
interested. She was like, I can't, like, do you have anything for me? Like, she literally showed me the
Mhm.
list on her piece of paper and she said, listen, I admire, your, like, what's the word? Uh, like interest in this basically. But like, you have to have one of these boxes checked in order for me to like order any of these. And so I was like, fine, click weight gain. I've gained 5 pounds lately,
Yeah.
intentionally, but I won't mention that part. Um, so I think from what I know, it's a criteria thing of like you can't just willy nilly be ordering these.
Yeah, understandable. But I mean, I feel like there are some clients that'll go in and say, I have all of these things, and they're still like, no, you're fine.
Or like the doctor will make like a visual judgment of like you look healthy,
Yeah,
you're fine.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But like, and I feel like women who quote unquote, or not just women, but like people who quote unquote look healthy, which is so subjective, right?
Mhm.
Like that's just the determination of your provider, but they're that much more likely to just kind of dismiss like symptoms and be like, no, you don't really need this. It's not like glaringly obvious that there's an issue, which can be really, really frustrating. So that's why, again, like Marissa and I are like, hey, like if you listen to this episode, hopefully you feel a little bit more confident
Sure.
in like ability to go and ask for these things. But I will say the unexplained weight gain or weight loss, that's a like kind of red flag to your provider. Also sleep and like having trouble sleeping, I feel like is a really, really big one that
Yeah.
they're interested in, like hair loss. Those are some other ones. And then fatigue, feeling really, really tired. And maybe you're not, but you can just tell them that you are.
Or also too, like the visual judgment thing. That like sometimes too, I've heard a lot of doctors will look at somebody who maybe looks physically unhealthy, and rather than going deeper under the hood with them, is kind of dismissive in the sense of like, well, clearly you're just overeating. Clearly you're just, you know, doing all these fat people behaviors of like overeating, not exercising. And like the reality is like a lot of these women that go to the doctor like just hoping for that ability to look deeper is because they are doing these things and their weight still
Yeah.
isn't moving. And then the sad part about it is like, you know, he said have confidence in advocating for yourself. Double-edged sword. Guess what happens when you unexplainably gain a bunch of weight and like your mood is all over the place and you're more depressed than usual? You're not as confident to advocate for
Yeah.
yourself. You feel more helpless, more hopeless. So, you know, with all that being said, you might have to do a little fake it till you make it to like get what you need out of the doctor. But if you say don't have a cooperative provider, I know some people that do, and I'm really happy for them. I know a lot of people that don't. Um, Western medicine is starting to come around, but it's really slow. It's a system, it's a whole thing, right? You can go through a third party provider and order labs on your own, where you just get the order, you go to a lab corp, they draw it, they send it to you. From my experience, the one that we have our clients use is about $250 to $275 for like a full thorough panel. And that is not actually that bad compared to if insurance doesn't cover all the labs that you want to get measured. You can be charged a lot out of pocket if your insurance doesn't cover everything that you're asking for. So it is pretty reasonable. It's obviously, you know, something that you'd have to invest in, but it is worthwhile if you're feeling this way and you want to find some answers.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of our clients who, same thing. She was like, I feel really confident. I think I really like this provider. Went in and she was like, I feel so defeated. Like I went home and cried because like I got blood work done and they told me to stop drinking alcohol and to move more, eat less. And she was like, I told them I don't drink alcohol. And she's literally eating like 800, 900 calories a day.
Yeah.
And so to tell someone that they need to eat less when they are literally starving themselves is like, yeah, it's hard, but they're not health and fitness coaches. They don't, that's just their general blanket statement with how to lose weight. So yeah, it can feel really, really frustrating. So um, Marissa kind of already said, like, hey, if we're going to get some basic lab work done, we want the complete blood count, we want the complete metabolic panel. I would also argue that within those things, we want to see insulin, vitamin D, and a lipid panel. I do really encourage that. And then we want to make sure we're doing that fasted if you're getting your blood glucose, A1C, anything like that. And then I will argue I think it is important, again, if we just want a baseline, to also kind of take a peek at thyroid and where our sex hormones are. And when you tell your providers this, sometimes they will only test like two things.
Yeah.
So if you need to be very, very specific when it comes to like a full thyroid panel or a full sex hormone, we want to do TSH, we want to do free T3, total T3, we want free T4, total T4, and then RT3 if you want to do your antibodies, TPO, and what is the last one? TGAB.
Mm-hmm. TPO-AB, I believe, is how it reads.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
capacities. Yeah. And then sex hormones, you're always going to want to look at total testosterone, free testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, sex hormone binding globulin, which is SHBG. And you can also look at your gonadotropins, luteinizing hormone, which is LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, which is FSH. Lipid panel, blood panel, metabolic panel, vitamin D, also iron and ferritin levels are great
Mm-hmm.
to look at. And one that I've become aware of that I don't often see on panels is a vitamin B12. That's actually a really great level to look at, especially if you're dealing with any sort of like mental and emotional issues and overall like kind of ADHD-ish symptoms and like just inability to focus, lots of overwhelm. That's a really, really good one to look at as well, because you could be taking in and eating a lot of foods with vitamin B12, even supplementing. But if it's not absorbed appropriately, like that level could still be deficient.
Yeah. And then the last one is cortisol. I
Yeah.
think that that's a huge one to
Agreed.
test. And it's usually one that we have to add on. It's not included.
Yeah.
So cortisol is a tricky one because you could be very, like, you would think like, oh, if I'm really stressed, like it's going to be really high, but you could actually be bottomed out because
Yeah.
so cortisol is a really interesting one. And then from there, based on these results, we can go a little bit deeper if we need to based on what we've seen. And then the other thing is typically we get some blood work back and then we'll implement a protocol depending on what we're seeing. And from there, we might need to dive a little bit deeper, do some additional testing. But that gives us, again, a really good baseline and something to kind of say like, okay, this is now what we're going to do and see if these symptoms improve. We can retest. In a perfect world. We can test, we can implement a protocol, we can retest at like 3 months, see where we're improving and then like continue to retest. But I know that that's not always feasible for everyone. So I think just kind of like almost we also do, I know that you do something similar, Marissa, kind of like we do like a health assessment questionnaire. So kind of like scoring different symptoms. I think that's really important to kind of mark where you feel like you are and then doing that again and kind of checking to see if like symptoms have improved. If you don't want to retest that frequently, that can also give you an indication that like, okay, symptoms are improving in certain areas.
Yeah. Well, some things I was actually going to warn against with this too is along the lines of getting so prescriptive, because at the end of the day, anyone who is like an online health coach does not reserve the right to diagnose you whatsoever. And
Yes,
we
yes.
are just helping symptom management. And so, with that being said, your symptoms, your quality of life can absolutely improve a lot with this. But even I've had to resist the urge to be like, ooh, this level and this level looks like hypothyroidism or whatever. Like, I can't say that. And like, it also doesn't help the person when you say something like that because it's just labels that make people feel more helpless. And so, if you have labs that indicate something's off and you have the symptomology to go along with it, then the labs are just aiding the knowledge that, like, it's not in your head. You can do something about it. Let's do something about it. And then what you really need to do from there is just monitor symptoms over time, knowing, okay, this is our root cause. Let's really work on that. And if symptoms improve or don't improve, then you can know whether or not to go back to the drawing board. But what I'll also say too that we kind of missed over, probably a good like just final thing on labs is when you go to your doctor to get these interpreted, you will more than likely be kind of told everything looks fine. The
Mhm.
reason why you are told that everything looks fine is because there are differences in how labs are interpreted between Western medicine and functional medicine. Functional medicine is this funny term that's been tossed around lately. You might not even know what it is, but it's essentially just looking at optimal and preventative health rather than um, rather than reactive health and just preventing disease. So the Western medical reference ranges, you'll see a big wide range. You'll see your number right in the smack dab middle of it, and your doctor will say you're good. Nothing's wrong with your thyroid, your cortisol, your vitamin D, but you feel like shit. And you're like, no, this can't be it. Find somebody who can interpret functional reference ranges because they're much tighter. The Western medical range is determined based on the general healthy, I won't say healthy, the general non diseased population. And the general non diseased population, I don't know if you've been able to look around lately in America, but it's not all that healthy. um, and so the absence of disease is not the same as health. It's a really important point to remember. And so when you're referencing yourself, you're normal compared to the non-disease population. That doesn't actually mean that you're optimal. That's why you still feel like shit, even though your labs are in range, quote unquote. So find somebody who can interpret the functional reference ranges, and you'll probably find that a lot more things are out of range than your regular doctor told you. And that's not something to freak out about, but I think it should be empowering in the sense that look at these things that we can do something about, that we can improve. And from there, implement protocols and look at symptom management and symptom severity over time. And that is really kind of your guiding compass.
Yeah. So with that being said, I mean, that's an awesome point. We also want a copy of our lab, like of our blood work, so we can look at it ourselves or give it out and get a second opinion. Because I know, again, this is another thing that you have to advocate for. Sometimes they won't give you a paper copy of them, or they won't upload the results in your patient portal. And so you literally have to fight them to get your results to like be able to see them for yourself. But again, it's important for just baseline purposes, right? Just having like records of your health. So definitely do that. And then there was one other thing that I was going to mention. Oh, so you were talking about, again, like, oh, you have hypothyroidism, or you have PCOS, or you have this. Like sometimes doctors will give you that quote unquote diagnosis, and then they'll also give you a blanket statement of like, oh yeah, this is going to make it hard for you to lose weight. And like, oh my gosh, like it's one of the worst things that you can tell someone. So again, we don't want to be victims of our diagnosis of our circumstances. And so you can look at it as like, okay, now I have some answers, and maybe this might make it more difficult for me, but like, what can I do to improve this? And just having a different outlook or mentality than potentially your provider has told you. So definitely want to recommend that as well.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap this one up.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Make sure you're subscribed to our podcast if you haven't already. You can find us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit. Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll see you back next week.